What if the first loss was not a story of punishment only, but the first page of a long, patient answering, the first rupture that made room for every cry and every miracle that follows? That is the question that hangs over the memory of one perfect morning, the morning the world first knew what it meant to be exiled. In the beginning, there was a garden. The east wind moved across a plain watered by rivers that ran from one spring. Trees leaned toward one another and offered fruit that was good to the eye and sweet to the taste. God formed the man from dust, and the breath of life made him living. God planted the garden and placed the man there to dress it and to keep it. A woman was taken from the man's side. Together they walked without shame beneath the open sky. In that place, the earth's bounty came as a given, water that did not need wells, food that did not demand toil beyond delight, and a room in the presence of God where speech with the Maker was as natural as breathing. Among the trees stood one that bore a peculiar command. It was not the only tree, but it was the test. Do not eat of it, for on the day you eat, you will surely know limits you had not known. The man and the woman ate at the urging of another voice, cunning, insistent, insinuating doubt against the quiet authority of God. In a single act, they crossed a boundary not meant for them. Shame altered the shape of their steps. The cool of the garden fled from their feet. Textures that had once been soft now pricked. Speech became clumsy, the clear fellowship broken. When God came in the cool of the day and called, they hid. Where before there was trust, there was now fear, and with fear came sentence. The ground would bear thorns, sweat would provide bread, the way back would be barred. Cherubim stood at the gate, a flaming sword turning to guard what had been a home. Paradise, as a present place of rest and intimacy, was closed to humankind. Yet the story did not end with a flaming sword. It stretched forward like a thread, carrying both the memory of what was lost and a promise that would take centuries to unfold. The loss made room for longing. The longing became the voice of prophets, of priests, of wandering hearts who looked for restoration. When the world is stripped of garden-like blessing, God's work among people begins in visible, noisy, and often surprising ways. Centuries later, in a land of hills and valleys, where the Jordan ran thin and bright through reeds and stone, a man turned his face from a field of many oxen and walked toward a calling that would gather those longings into a living witness. His name was Elisha. Once he had the large household of a farmer, many oxen, many yokes, servants at ease under a noon sun. He was a man of the soil, his hands used to furrow and to bind, his feet to the compacted earth. But life is vulnerable. The boy became ill unexpectedly and died in his mother's arms. The grief was like a familiar old wound, the kind of thing that pulls a family to the ground. The mother laid the boy on Elisha's bed and went out to the prophet, who, when he received the scene, withdrew alone and prayed. He stretched himself upon the child, and his mouth grew warm with petition. The boy's heart resumed its beating, as if a dormant spring had been opened. The child rose to the house, alive. An astonishing reversal that read like a note from the Creator to those who had lost their own garden. Life could be restored. Elisha's life was threaded with small, practical wonders that repaired the fabric of ordinary households. Once, when the sons of the prophets gathered, their stew proved poisonous for lack of fresh meat that had been improperly prepared. None ate, yet the men were hungry and afraid. Elisha took flour, threw it into the pot, and the poisonous quality vanished. Bread, barley cakes multiplied to feed a crowd of hungry men from little stock, signs that spoke plainly to a people who understood the value of daily bread. An iron axe head, lost to the bog while a man felled a tree for a fence or a roof, was made to float when Elisha cut a stick and cast it upon the water where the iron lay submerged. Such a small, rugged miracle restored what was needed for living, for work, for family. The God who had been in Eden and walked in cool of the day could again make the practical things of life whole. There were wider displays of God's concern, acts that answered not only private need but national anxiety. Syrian raids pressed upon Israel like a shadow. In one valley, the king's army prepared to ambush the city, confident in its concealment. The sons of the prophets were confined, and they might have been taken. But Elisha, whose sight served more than the eye, perceived the enemy's designs. To his servant, who trembled at the sight of a surrounding force, he prayed that the Lord would open his servant's eyes. When God did, the servant saw not merely men in tents, but horses and chariots of fire all around the hill. The visible world was swaddled in divine defense. Later, when an entire Syrian army encamped against Dothan with a plan to take Elisha himself, the prophet awoke before dawn, said to his servant simply to fear not, and he prayed that God would blind the band. When the Lord did so, Elisha led the men, now blind, into Samaria. There he gave them food and water, and sent them back to their master in sight and in peace. Even captors could leave with their bellies full, an act that transformed hostility into a witness of mercy. Not every encounter was a gentle overturning of violence into warmth. Pride had its day and its fall. Naaman, commander of the kings of Aram's chariots, was a man of stature and war. He carried leprosy's mark, a disease that in that land often forced men from camps and markets, a sickness that carried social exile. Sent by his king to seek healing in Israel, he came with gifts and honor, expecting a dramatic word, a ceremony worthy of his rank. Instead, Elisha's messenger told him to wash in the Jordan 7 times. Pride bristled. He thought of the rivers of Damascus, the streams of his own home, and he almost turned away. But counsel softened him. He plunged into Jordan's waters as directed and came forth clean, his skin like a newborn's, his shame undone. Naaman knelt and confessed the God of Israel. There was a shadow to that joy. Gehazi, Elisha's servant, moved with the hush of avarice. He coveted the gifts Naaman had offered and schemed to secure them by falsehood. When Elisha discerned the deceit, Gehazi was struck with a malady like Naaman's former affliction, an outward sign that greed had its spiritual price. Gehazi's face, once a face among the servants, bore now a mark that spoke of judgment, not only for his sake, but as a warning that the holy work of the prophet cannot be bartered for reward. A siege came upon Samaria, and with the city the hard facts of famine made the heart ache in a way stories must whisper and not show. Hunger grew like a shadow at the gate. People weighed the cost of each bite. A prophet's word cut through the despair. Abundance would come. The Lord would open the storehouses of supply. Skepticism and hope tangled in the market. Then, by an event that read like a reprisal against despair, 4 men who had intended to surrender to the Syrians discovered the camp empty, its tents still steaming with the food and wine of the enemy. Rushing back, they found the city gates stirred. The supply flood began. One official, who had rushed to eat and failed to control himself in the hour of plenitude, found his excuse and excuse-taking costly. The fulfillment of prophecy traversed fear into a place where even the voice of a scornful courtier would not go unheard. The memory of hunger left as people walked the streets with loaves and oil in their arms. Years advanced like caravans across a plain. Elisha's words sometimes settled into the ear of kings. He told Joash, Israel's ruler, to take a bow and to strike the ground as a sign that victory words would be given to the nation. Joash struck thrice, and Elisha was angry that he had struck so little, a sign that the work of God invites boldness and faith proportionate to the need. When Elisha died, the grief of those who loved him gathered like a cloud. His body was buried, a final silence over a life that had been a long litany of acts in God's name. Yet even death could not hold the consequence of that life. A man was thrown into the grave shaft near Elisha's tomb in haste, and when his body touched the bones of the prophet, life returned. The miracle read like a rib of the first story, a reversal that suggested, though paradise was lost long ago, God's power to give life could still surprise the world and undo, in measure, what exile had wrought. If there is a moral for the wanderers who read such tales, it is this: the absence of Eden is not the end of God's motion toward His people. Loss has left us with longings that become the very places God chooses to reveal Himself. The mantle on the Jordan bank is a reminder that what is given must be used to repair and to bless. The spring at Jericho teaches that what was bitter can be made wholesome. The raising of a child in Shunem means that even the finality of death sometimes meets the uncontained compassion of God. And the final, strange miracle, the man whose corpse touched the bones of a dead prophet and rose, tells us plainly that the line between death and life is not God's final word. These are not merely stories for the imagination, they are invitations. They ask those who hear to serve the neighbor, to speak truth within human failings, to refuse to trade holiness for gain, and to remember that obedience and humility often stand at the hinge of God's interventions. The loss of the first garden was absolute as history. The hope that fills the long tale that follows is provisional and persistent. It is given in fragments: signs in the cities, restored springs, healed commanders. And in those fragments, the ancient longing for paradise faintly breathes again. If this recounted path from the first loss to the small restorations of a prophet's life moved something in you, consider carrying the story forward. Tell it to the neighbor. Speak of mercy where there is hunger. Offer shelter like the woman of Shunem. The narrative of God's work is not closed. It beckons response. If this account of loss and long repair has stirred you, subscribe and share so these old, loud promises might find new ears. They kept telling the stories as one keeps embers, not to warm the hands alone, but so the fire will live. In market courts and by threshing floors, in the shade of sycamores and beneath the sky that had watched the old garden close, elders spoke of the small, stubborn mercies that followed Elisha's days. They spoke of a widow whose oil never ceased until debts were paid and children fed, of a table set every day for a woman who made a room for the prophet and received a son in return, of a pot of death made edible again by a handful of flour and a man's faithful prayer. Each tale, when named, drew nearer to ordinary needs: bread, shelter, a child's cry in the night. The marvelous in those tales was not spectacle alone, but an answer that entered the ordinary seam of life and mended it. Among the sons of the prophets there was a steadiness that looked like common work. They did not wear their mantle as a trophy, they used it. When iron tools fell into the deep where men could not reach, one of them would wade and bend under the water to bring it up, remembering how the iron axe head in the river had once been lifted as a sign. When a spring flowed bitter and made the land unfit, they carried of the water that had been made sweet, and taught the elders where to dig and how to channel the stream. They taught farmers to plant in ways that guarded the earth and mercy, terraces for water, small pits to hold the rain, grain kept for the lean. The miracles lived into practices. The wonder was apprenticed to faithful labor. There were men who came to them from courts and tents of kings, from chariots and the tented encampments of strangers. Naaman, the commander, had been a name that carried both fear and respect. When he returned to his homeland, cured and bowed, his healing became a word carried across borders. He spoke, where he could, of the God who humbled him. In some places, his report loosened the hearts of men too proud to bend. Yet the tale that followed him, of the servant who schemed for the prophet's gifts and found only disgrace, served as a counterweight. Gehazi's desire had not undone the mercy. It warned that miracles could be a mirror as well, showing the true contour of a man's heart. The sons of the prophets learned not only to seek signs, but to judge what sign made of the seeker. Children were taught by the stories, as their elders had once been taught by deeds. A boy whose family had known hunger watched a neighbor pour oil until the jars brimmed, and remembered the hands that taught the woman her measure. A girl who had sat in a small room where the prophet had slept listened to the tale of a son returned from death, and kept in secret a slow, stubborn courage that no final darkness could wholly smooth away. The tales were not mere consolation, they were instructions in patience and in the economy of giving. To remember the springs and the loaves was to remember where mercy begins, in the choice to share the thing at hand. At times, the mantle became a test. A prophet's student would be given a charge: visit a house where strangers wept, bring a cup of water, speak a word of peace. The test was not whether a thunder came or eyes flashed with fire. It was whether the student would refuse obscurity when it waited at the door. Humility and patience were the instruments by which the sons of the prophets measured themselves. They learned that obedience often looked like small things: staying when work was slow, listening when counsel was needed, returning a borrowed tool without boasting, and that such habits were the soil in which signs grew. There were harder stories too. A city would be set upon by violence. A famine would strip a region of the thin supply it had carefully gathered. In these seasons, the memory of the garden came sharp and almost cruel. Men asked the old question with new urgency: if God restores springs and raises the dead, why must children starve? Why must a father stand with empty hands? The answer they found was not a neat theodicy, but a summons. Outside, under the stars, the wind carried the smell of ripening figs and riverweed. Men who had once stood beside Elisha were gone in body, but not in instruction. Their habits remained like furrows in a field. It is this, the continuity of honest mercy, that held the long story together. For though a gate to a first garden was barred, for though the sword had turned, something of the ancient intention kept appearing in the lives of those who answered need. They became, in a slow and irreplaceable way, the hands by which God continued to move among His people. In the telling of their deeds, the story reached forward and asked each listener a question: Will you take up what has been given and use it to repair? The lamp burned on. A young hand reached for the old strip of cloth, not in triumph, but in a kind of trembling agreement. The old man nodded. "Use it," he said, and there was no show in his saying, only a passing of responsibility, and the simple, relentless hope that the mantle would not be folded and laid away. Outside, somewhere a spring ran clearer than it had the month before. A widow's jars held oil. A boy who had once been given a small mercy now showed another how to mend a fence. The repair continued, small and cumulative, until the very shape of the people began, in certain places, to resemble again the posture for which they had been made. Hands open more than clenched, tables set rather than guarded, children taught the names of those who were poor. Such was the way they kept the memory of the garden, not by lamenting its loss until all else was lost, but by living out, in the honest and ordinary places of life, the intention that had borne them. The mantle was not a promise that the past would return intact. It was an instrument with which to shape the present toward what was good, toward what made for life. And so the night wore on. The lamp tired. The stories passed from voice to voice as the town listened. Outside, the river moved on, carrying with it leaves and light. And somewhere the bones of a prophet, at rest in their place, were themselves the sign of a hope that would not be contained by final ends. The city slept, and in the sleeping the story held, a quiet, steady vow that the work of restoration, begun in a garden and continued at a riverbank, would not cease while hands were willing to labor and hearts were willing to bend. Dawn came as if by agreement. The pale rim of light pressed softly against the town's roofs, and the lamp under the low roof guttered into memory. The old man lay back on his elbow and watched the young faces go pale with mourning. He had said his small thing, had passed the strip of cloth as if passing bread, and now the gift moved like a secret among the listeners. Micah, who had reached for the cloth with the trembling hand, folded it beneath his tunic and stepped out while the air still held the cool of the river. The street was waking. They each took the other's hand, briefly, the gesture quick and shy, and the crowd drew breath as if waking. It was a small thing, the mending of wood. Yet, when the sun rose and the shadow of the city gate shrank, some who had lingered said to one another that it was surprising how little was needed to change the course of anger. Micah left them there and walked toward the house of the widow whose jars had held oil. She was out in her courtyard tending a low fire. Her hair had a streak of gray that had not been there the year before. Her hands moved with the habits of a lifetime, each motion a story. When she saw Micah, she smiled in a manner that held both welcome and the old guardedness of one who had lived with scarcity. "Child," she said, "what brings you so early?" He drew close, and without the flourish of a man seeking favor, unfastened the cloth and laid it across her lap. "You keep this for my mother," he said. "She remembers how you shared once." The widow touched the cloth as if it was part of the loom. She had given oil when there was no law that demanded she do so, and the memory of that giving had reached further than the jars could hold. She looked up at Micah, and then, quietly, to the river. "Keep your hands busy," she said, half to him and half to herself. "The mind grows restless if the hands tire not." They spoke no more of miracles. Instead, they sat and broke a flatbread and ate together. A neighbor came and sat at the edge of the courtyard, bringing news of a boy who had fallen from a roof and now lay fevered in the house across the way. The widow wiped her hands and stood. Micah followed her. The boy who had fallen was curled on a pallet, the fever making him small and tight as a bird. The mother sat at the head of the bed and clutched at the hem of her tunic in a manner that spoke of prayer without words. Micah did what he could. He fetched cool water. He fanned the boy's limbs. He whispered to the mother that she must open the shutters to the breeze. None of this was astonishing. Yet the mother held his hand, and when the fever broke, whether by craft or by grace or by the simple order of the body, the house sighed as if relieved of a burden it had been carrying for years. From the courtyard of the boy, word moved through the alleys like a soft reed in the wind. A young man with an old strip of cloth had come and had done what mercy does. People looked at one another, and some thought that perhaps the stories of old men and their mantles were not only about thunder and fire and sudden signs, but about hands steadying a fevered child, or mending a splintered yoke. By mid-morning, Micah found himself at the outskirts where the town's road gave way to open land. There, on a hill, a small company gathered. A woman with a basket of figs, a soldier returned from a distant watch with a limp, an old teacher whose eyes had dimmed but whose tongue still held sharp words. They were arguing softly over a matter of a well, whether it should be widened, whether the common should share its water, whether the boundary stones of an adjoining field meant that some would drink and others go thirsty. The argument had the shape of ancient things, an old hurt, an old scarcity, the question of how to share. Micah listened, and then, as if taking counsel from the strip of cloth, he walked to the well and knelt. He cleared the mouth of stones, and with hands that had known hard work, he reached down and hauled up a bucket that smelled of deep cold. He poured a little water into the palm of the teacher, offering it as one might offer a word that must be tasted. The soldier drank, and then laughed, a sound of surprise more than joy, and the woman with the figs sat down on a stone as if she were suddenly very tired. "Who owns the mouth of the well?" the teacher asked, not with anger, but with the curiosity of one who had given too many lessons and learned too few. "No one," said the woman. "We all do, but some forget." Micah did not speak of law. He told a small story instead, of a child who had been hungry, and of a handful of bread placed on a window-sill, which drew a neighbor who had been ashamed and hungry himself. He told it plainly and without claim. The people listened to the story as to a taste. Then they spoke of the well in terms that were no longer only about rights, but about who would carry the bucket the next time the rope frayed. They set a day in which each would take a turn to repair the well's edge, and a day in which the richer would sit with the poorer to divide the harvest of the fig trees. It was a sequence of small arrangements, nothing like a proclamation from a king, nothing written in the city's records. But when the sun struck the hillside and the town below moved like a mosaic of roofs and smoke, a neighbor already began to fetch stones for the well's rim. Micah walked back toward the river, and as he moved, he felt the cloth like a quiet promise at his side. He had not called down fire. He had not spoken as an oracle. He had used his hands and his ears and his willingness to be near. In that doing, the shape of his day altered subtly. He felt lighter in a way that did not come from power, but from the knowledge of having answered. Evening crept again along the river. The old son of the prophets sat beneath his roof, his beard white in the last light. The young ones returned and gathered as they had before, their faces telling of errands and of little mercies done. Micah came in with clay dust on his feet, and a quiet about him like a second robe. He unwrapped the strip of cloth and laid it on the lap of the old man. "You told me to use it," he said, and his voice was small. "I used it to bind a yoke, and to hold a fevered hand, and to remind men of the well. I have nothing to show but those things, and yet my days are full."
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era "Show but those things, and yet my days are full." Você está no meio de uma frase, pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. The old man looked at him and saw, perhaps, the same trembling that had been there when he had first taken up the mantle. He reached out and placed his hand over Micah. "It is enough," he said. "It is the work given to us, to keep being near and willing. The large signs come as they will. We are not always the ones to call them down. But the small and steady work, this is how the world is mended." They sat a while and then spoke of other matters, of the boy whose fever had broken and who now would learn the names of the poor, of the farmer and the keyholder who had learned to fix a yoke, of the well on the hill. The lamp burned low. The river moved with its usual faithfulness. Yet beyond the ordinary of these repairs, there was a rumor, coiled and soft as fog, that had begun to move along the caravan routes. Men returning from distant markets spoke of a drought beyond the ridge of the plain. Others said a new lord had taken the caravan road and raised a standard. Such talk might have been only passing noise, the kind that towns bear as they bear the weather. Yet whispers have the way of growing, and whispers of drought reach the ears of those who can scarce spare grain. The old man did not dismiss the murmur. He had seen years in which smaller needs had swelled into greater ones. He recalled, too, a story he had heard long ago, of a prophet whose bones, in their silence, carried a warning. He watched the faces of his pupils lighted by the lamp, and he placed the strip of cloth aside, not as a thing to be hoarded, but as a companion for the days to come. Night deepened. From the far road a voice called, and a traveler, dusty and bent, slid into the street. He bore news on his tongue and exhaustion in his shoulders. He would sit by the gate and tell what he had seen. Fields cracked like old pottery. Towns where wells had dropped into silence. Men with empty hands who still hoped. The old man rose, slow but steady, and took the traveler by the shoulder. The young ones leaned forward. The knight, which had been long accustomed to stories of small repair, now listened with a different angle, one that remembered that kindness might be needed not only for mending yokes or easing fevers, but for standing when the land itself threatened to withdraw its mercy. And so, the city that had kept the memory of the garden by doing small things found its next test appearing at the edge of hearing. Hands were willing, hearts, by habit, were willing to bend. But the measure of willingness would soon be tested in a manner greater than the fixing of a yoke or the cooling of a fever. The mantle lay folded on a bench, waiting, and the river kept its slow promise of movement. The traveler spoke with a voice that had the hush of dust in it. He told of cracked ground that split like old pottery, of grasses gone brittle, of herds gaunt and hollow-eyed.
He said that the nearest town to the east had sent their last sacks of seed on carts toward a distant lord. He said the caravans moved slower, and in places men kept watch by the wells as though guarding something precious and fragile. When he paused, the night held its breath. The young ones looked at one another, and the lamp's flame seemed suddenly a small signal on a far shore. The old man rose. He did not speak of fear. He spoke of work. "Hear what he brings," he said. "We will not be idle. Let us call the elders at dawn. Let the women gather what stores we have. Let the blacksmith fix the links of the carts. Let the boys watch the road and count the wagons. If the land withdraws, we must answer by keeping what is given." Micah kept his hands folded, the strip of cloth heavy with memory on his lap. The old man's eyes found the cloth and then the youth. "You were near," he said. "You will be near again. Take the cloth where work must be done. Let it bind the broken and remind the weary. But do not go as one who seeks glory. Go as one who keeps a single office, to be present." Micah's voice was small but steady. "I will go," he said. "I will travel to the neighbor towns. I will show them how to mend a yoke, to dig where water hides, to store grain in hollowed rock. I will listen and learn the shape of their poverty, so our hands can meet it." They spoke until the lamp guttered, and the traveler slept with his head upon his cloak. Plans were set like stones for a causeway. Routes to check, granaries to open, women who could teach saving and sifting, a council to speak with merchants passing in the morning. A boy was sent with a bell to wake the cottages, an elder to rouse the smith. Before sleep fell on the little house, the old man took the mantle from the bench and folded it with the same care anyone would fold a promise. "We go by small labor," he said into the quiet, "and by stubbornness of mercy. The great things come in ways we cannot command. We must be awake for whatever shape they take." Dawn would bring the city to the gate. Dawn would bring decisions that were not single words, but 1,000 hands moving in one direction. The river kept its patient course. The people would keep theirs. The lamp died. Outside, the first footsteps began.